Today I'm joined by historian Bob Marks to explore one of the most fascinating landscapes in the American West, the Mono Lake Basin. Across 10,000 years of history, we talk about migrating birds, alkali flies, indigenous lifeways, water wars, environmental collapse, and the fragile ecosystems that still shape the American West. This is a discussion about deep time, climate change, colonialism, the thirst by Los Angeles for water, and the long relationship between humans and the natural world. Along the way, we talk about the Mono Basin and how it connects ancient geology, the Northern Paiute, hydroelectric development, and even migration patterns of the tiny Wilson's phalarope into one sweeping environmental story. We also dig into the power of environmental history itself. We talk about historians like Dan Flores and Sarah Dant, the legacy of California water wars, the shadow of Chinatown hanging over Western water politics, and why understanding the past might still give us hope for the future. If you've ever wondered how landscapes shape civilizations, or how entire ecosystems can hinge on something as small as a fly or a bird, this is an episode you won't want to miss. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. It's good. We were just saying beforehand, actually, I want to hear it now because we were just talking about this just absolutely exquisite. I'm a sucker, Bob. Like, I will absolutely judge a book by its cover. I know I'm not supposed to, but I love it. And this book cover is gorgeous. You were just going to tell me about the book cover. Like, what's the deal on this thing?
Well, as I wrote the preface, I think the last sentence or two, as my wife and I lying on the beach of South Mono Lake, looking at night, looking up at the Milky Way, because it's just absolutely clear here. I mean, it's beautiful. We're not labeled as a dark sky environment, but it's dark up in here. And then I said, geez, it would be really nice if I had a photograph of the nights of the Milky Way, but I don't. But a neighbor of mine who lives 5-minute walk down the street is a night sky photographer. And so I asked him, I said, Phil, do you happen to have a photograph of the Milky Way? And he said, I've got several. And so he gave me several of these to take a look at. And this one was absolutely the most astounding one. It's a bit of a time-lapse one. And so he's thrilled that I'm using it, and he's got an Instagram account, and he's been having it out there as well. So it's just one of those interesting intersections. This is a rural area up here. There's only 600 people who live in the village of full-time residents in June Lake. And so those of us who are close to each other help each other out all the time with all kinds of stuff. And the photographer's name is Phil Sutphin. And if you take a look at the cover, the photograph goes all the way from the front all the way to the back. It's one photograph.
It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. And I tell you, it drew me to your work when I came across it. And then I just, as I'm reading through the book over the last several days, and I just recently finished, I had this photograph in my head the whole time. That and this bird that we're going to talk about a little bit later on.
Yeah. That's good.
And one particular movie that you and I have probably both seen a few different times as well. But we'll get into that one in a bit. I loved the book, and this was such a wonderful. I hadn't read your work before, so this is such a wonderful entry for me to get to read your stuff. But before we jump into that, do you maybe want to introduce yourself to our audience and tell us like who you are and what you're doing here?
Who am I? Why am I here?
You have all day.
My name is Bob Marks. I retired after 41 years of teaching history and environmental studies at Whittier College in Southern California. And my wife and I knew that we wanted to be up in this part of the world that we're now in, which is June Lake. We're in the Mono Lake Basin on the southern edge of it. And we retired up here in 2019. My background is as a environmental historian of China and the world. And those that's where my scholarship was. That's what everything, and you have to learn no Chinese to be able to do research in Chinese history. So it's a little bit slower work than doing work in where the sources are all in English. Anyway, as we would drive up and back from Southern California to the Mono Lake Basin, since the early 90s. And you go through the Owens Valley, and then you come up, that's about 4,000 feet above sea level. And you've got the Sierra Nevada on one side. You've got the White Mountains on the other. Mount Whitney, the highest mountain in the lower 48, is about 100 miles south of us here. And just going through that valley and then coming up here where it becomes we're at 7,500 feet, nestled literally right up against the mountains. I see the crest when I look out my window. I said, somebody should really do an environmental history of the Eastern Sierra. It's got a lot of story here. And so when we retired and I started looking around and poking around and doing things, I realized it wouldn't be possible to do a history of the Eastern Sierra. That goes all the way from the Mojave Desert up into southern Oregon. This is so the Sierra Nevada mountain range is 400 miles long, north and south. And we're on the east side, which locates us in an interesting place. And as I began digging into it, I realized that there was enough material, both published and then archival material, on the Mono Lake Basin to make it possible to do a research monograph. But when I started talking with people about it, I said, you don't want to write a research monograph on this. You want to reach a broader audience. And so I recast it several times with the help of a number of people. Don Worster, I don't know if you know Don.
I know his work. I haven't had the privilege. Yeah. Very much want to.
Don was very helpful in helping me think through this. John McNeil was also helpful because one of the most successful books I wrote is The Origins of the Modern World, which is designed for freshmen and sophomores in college. And that's in its 6th edition and has about 150,000 copies sold since 2002. And so Don and John said, all you have to do is talk to like you're talking to an 18 or 19-year-old. So I can do that. So that's the voice that comes through in Deep Time in the Mono Lake Basin.
Well, I'll tell you a couple of things. First of all, this 48-year-old really appreciated it. As I'm reading the book, this really hit my sweet spot, Bob, and I really want to talk a lot about this because, as my evolution as a scholar, I wrote my dissertation on the ethnogenesis of the Seminole people and really kind of talking about how the introduction of cattle influenced that, that ethnogenesis. And so much of this is really in, not all the book, but much of it is rooted in the, in the intersections between indigenous and environmental history. There's some wonderful stuff we're going to talk about here in this a little bit later in this episode. And then there was this wonderful transition, I thought, because you carried the story all the way to today. And I guess maybe we should backtrack a little bit because I opened this up. I'm like 10,000 years. I'm thinking Fernand Braudel, the longue durée. Maybe for our listeners who were once 18 and have long passed that since then, maybe we can talk about what this idea of deep time actually means because I love how you did this.
Well, first, again, let me put going 10,000 years into the context of my other work.
Sure.
my Tigers book on China covered 400 years from 1400 to 1800, late Qing dynasty. Then I did an environmental history of China. And, China's got a long history, and that's 5,000 years. The history of the modern world is 400 years or so. So I've always been interested in doing longue durée, right? That's a French term. And you can use that in scholarly monographs, but you can't use that in something that's wants to reach a broader audience. So the concept of deep time, Dan Flores used it as well when he was talking about bioregional approaches to history, and he used the term deep time. But the term actually was used first by John McPhee, a very engaged amateur geologist who, in an important book that was done in the early 80s called Basin and Range, he was trying to help geologists explain the age of the Earth, 4 billion years or so. And he said, if you stretch your arms out wide like this, and imagine that is the 4 billion years of the universe, then you can do this, do that, do the other things. And that is deep time. You're looking at deep time into the history of the Earth. And he says, when you get to humans, they're like the fingernail. It's about that much time. So deep time was first used by a geologist trying to explain eons, epochs, and all that stuff, which I still can't keep straight in my head. But it's the idea that there's a very deep time, and that to understand it, we need to understand where we are located in that. The other thing to say about the last 10,000 years is that that's basically the Holocene, which is the term for the current epoch, which follows the last glaciation, which came, 13,000 years or so ago. So we are at a time that the Holocene is when agriculture develops around the world. It's where writing emerges. It's where civilizations emerge. That's where the Chinese state emerged. And so it is this moment in climatic history where it is unusual to have warmth and water and all the stuff that makes it possible for agriculture and many other things as well. It's also the time when actually we now know that the first humans got to the Americas probably sometime around 23,000 years ago. The White Sands footprints are just absolutely amazing. But people got into the Mono Lake Basin probably around 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last glaciation and before many other things were happening. So the idea is that to understand where we are now, both environmentally, climatically, and in terms of people and our history here, we got to take a very, very long-term look. And fortunately, there's enough material that paleoarchaeologists and anthropologists have done on the Mono Lake Basin that helps us get a really long-term view of what happened over the last 10,000 years. When we get to the so-called history, when Euro-Americans and the American state bring writing and everything else and weapons to the area, then there's a whole lot more you can say in detail.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating thing because I get to feel like I'm getting all these wonderful vignettes through time as I'm reading through the book. And yes. I think for people who are not familiar with, say, California history or maybe of the West, things like that, certainly people like me, before I cracked open the book, I was even mispronouncing the name wrong as I opened up the book.
Okay, so here's what you need to know, and everybody else needs to know about the spelling of the basin. Mono. Now, most people will, and encountering that, will say mono. And my response is, the lake is not a disease. It's mono. Right?
It's a gorgeous lake.
It is.
And so it's, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you, to get a sense as to where we are, and it is a small place. The Mono Lake Basin is about 700 square miles. and it's located at about 6,400 feet above sea level on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. And that puts us politically in Eastern California. So I can look out right now, I can look out at the crest of the Sierra Nevada, and on the other side is Yosemite National Park.
Mm.
So as the eagle flies, as the crow flies, as the Wilson's phalarope flies, it's about 40 miles to Yosemite. So if you know where Yosemite is, we're on the other side of the mountain from that. But it's not useful to think about us as being in California. We're closer to the Nevada border than we are to Sacramento or San Francisco. It's a 6-hour drive to get to San Francisco from here. It's a 6-hour drive to get to Los Angeles from here. We're a long way from anything, to say the least. Right? It's a long way. But environmentally, we have very in common with the rest of California. We have much more in common with what's known as the Great Basin or the Basin and Range. This huge basin that extends, well, depending on which way you want to look at it. If we're looking east, it extends over through Great Salt Lake and the Wasatch Mountains, and then north up to the Snake River Valley or range, and then south to the Mojave Desert. And the thing about the Great Basin is that no water, fresh water that comes from snowmelt from any of these mountains ever gets out. It comes into the basin and pools in various low-lying places that become lakes, and over time, this fresh water evaporates and the saline and alkali levels increase over time. So all the lakes in the Great Basin are saline of one way or another, including the Great Salt Lake. So there's commonalities in the history of the Mono Lake Basin with the Great Salt Lake as well. So that's where we're at, and that's where that's what John McPhee was describing in his book Basin and Range. It's a really interesting read, but it's and what he wrote it for is if you think about this the Great Basin, it's oftentimes just simply dismissed as wasteland, desert, just sagebrush. Who the hell wants? What can you get out of that? Nothing. And McPhee was saying, look, it's got a geology, it's got an environment, it's got its own basis. So another person who was describing the Great Basin called it the Great Sagebrush Ocean.
I love
Stephen
that.
Trimble. And through the basin, there are ranges of mountains, about 100 different ranges. So you go up and over and down and across. And most of it is sagebrush, but you get up onto the hills and the mountains, and you get junipers, you get pinyon pines, and then where I am, I'm just looking out here. You're in a Jeffrey pine forest that is these massive 150, 200 foot tall pines that some of the ones around here are so big that they're about 400 years old.
So I have to tell you, when I'm reading the book, I had to pause every so often and get on Google so I could start to look at what these things are. Yeah. I had to Google the phalarope. I had to Google the fly that we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah.
The entire ecosystem. And it's interesting you say this because there's very much this idea about natural versus human, right?
Yes.
You talk about this in the book, and certainly things I've thought about as far as and Dan Flory certainly talks about this. Really, the idea that humans are just part of this natural world. Right. Yes. And I know when you're making these delineations, it's really saying everything but human, because, we're talking about the idea is none of the snowpack makes it out of the basin until the city of Los Angeles really starts to do its thing. Right.
Right. Yeah.
And then there's this almost feels like it becomes this horror story of environmental degradation. You spend a lot of time early on, and I really appreciated this, really kind of talk about the geology of the spaces, the mountains, the hydrology. I was married into a family of engineers, and I was I was recognizing words and terms all of a sudden. The flies. So how do I pronounce the alkali flies? Is alkali that right?
Fly, yeah.
Right. You want to talk about this fly, because this fly becomes very important to the early part of this story. Why is it so important to really get to the nuts and bolts to kind of create this world when you're telling this history?
Okay, so Mono Lake is about 13 to 15 miles east to west and 8 or 9 north to south. So, as lakes go, it's a pretty big one. But it is not a freshwater lake. It is a saline lake. And only 2 animals have evolved to actually live in or around that environment. The one is a brine shrimp, 1/4 inches of translucent little guy. There's trillions of them every year that are there. And because nothing else can live in it, there's no natural predators. So that's there. The other that has evolved to its life cycle in the lake, but the adults don't actually live in it, is the alkali fly. This is a small little guy. Millions of them are along the shoreline. And you walk through and you'd think, oh my God, we're going to get bit by these flies. They don't care about humans. They just move out of the way and you walk through them. They don't jump on. They don't get in your eyes. They don't get in your nose. They don't bite. They're just innocuous. But they have a life cycle that is really quite astounding. How they evolved to do this, I have no idea. But the female, when they breed, the female envelops her body in a sack of air and then swims down to the bottom of the lake and lays her eggs there that get attached to the substrate. The eggs then hatch into larvae, which become food sources for birds and other things. And then the larvae attach themselves to the rocks, to the tufa, and pupate. They build a cocoon and they pupate there. And at some point, they get dislodged and they pop up to the surface and float on the surface of the lake. So the alkali fly themselves, the pupae, and then the brine shrimp are the basis. Well, they live off of algae and then bacteria on the shore, are the basis for the entire biotic community.
Right? You do this amazing thing where you're using this another winged creature. I'm trying to go here, man. This Wilson's phalarope.
Yeah.
Yet another really cute little bird to kind of tell this story, kind of bring us through time. Do you want to tell us about this bird? Because this is a really important part of the story.
Yeah. Well, the Mono Lake attracts migratory birds of all kinds. There's ducks, there's geese, there's California gulls, there's eared grebes. There's just all kinds of migratory birds that come to the lake and feed on it and nest and do a number of other things. But the Wilson's phalarope is perhaps the most astounding. So it's not a big bird, it's kind of a little bird like that. But they migrate from a saline lake in Argentina up through the flyway, up past Mono Lake, but they stop at Mono Lake, and their breeding grounds is up in the grasslands of Canada. So in 1 year, they will fly between 8 and 10,000 miles and swoop down and stay at Mono Lake. And what they do there is they gorge themselves on the brine shrimp, on the alkali flies, on the pupae, everything else, and then they molt.
Mm-hmm.
And they shed their old feathers and they grow new feathers back, so that they can continue up to Canada, and then to fly back all the way to Argentina. It's one of the most astounding stories of migratory birds ever, right? And so their existence as a species depends on saline lakes. They're also stop over at Great Salt Lake. They stop over at Lake Ebert in southern Oregon and a few other places. But the species is dependent, and it's if it goes extinct because the saline lakes don't make it. Great Salt Lake is in a serious problem right now. Lake Abert is in a serious problem. Mono Lake is, for better or for worse, and at this point it's for better, is the only semi-protected saline lake in the Western Hemisphere that this species can depend on.
Wow. Are these birds going to all the way, I guess, east to Salt Lake as well, or is this only?
It's different groups.
Okay. So we talk about this, and of course, there's this whole other group of now people we've got to talk about, the Kutsaduka'a. I think I'm pronouncing it, butchering it.
I'll give it to you.
Kutsaduka. Okay, thank you. Kutsaduka. Yeah. All right, and there's a more common name that we know of today.
Yeah. Paiutes.
Yeah. Northern Paiute. Is that right?
Yeah. Northern.
You want to talk about this indigenous relationship to this particular region and why this is so important, and you carry this all the way through, because as we get into, say, the contemporary age, there are legal battles still that are very much affected by the allotments and so forth. So, I mean, the Northern Paiute remained a very strong presence throughout this book and all the way to today, right?
Yes, indeed. So, I said that humans first got into the Mono Lake Basin about 10,000 years ago, maybe earlier, longer ago than that, maybe a little later. And those folks were probably coming through and not staying because, they're following game, big game, small game, doing other things. But one of the really interesting turning points was it's not just people who migrate into the Mono Lake Basin, but after the last glaciation, the glaciation had pushed a lot of the trees out of this area into areas that other parts of the basin, of the Great Basin, where they could live. And one of those was the pinyon pine tree. Mm-hmm. And after the last glaciation, you don't think of pinyon pine trees or trees as migrating, but the pinyon pine trees started migrating from their refuge in what is now the Mojave Desert, 300 miles up here to the Mono Lake Basin, and then also into the rest of the Great Basin. And the reason why this is important is because the pinyon pine cones are a major source of food for squirrels, bears, jays, and people. And it made it possible for people to live year-round in the Mono Lake Basin. Now, we're talking about centuries here. By about 2,000 years ago, this other group of peoples, the Numu peoples, came from the south and got into, they came to the Mono Lake Basin and found it possible to have enough sources of food we can get into the sources of food, to make it possible for them to live year-round in the basin. So the Kizedeka people have been in and around the Mono Lake Basin, living here continuously for about 2,000 years. Not migrating out. They had trade relations over into what is now Yosemite, down to the south, doing all kinds of other things. But this was their home.
Sure.
This is their home. This is their homeland. 2,000 years is a long time to have a connection to one place. And the Kizedeka have that here, right? So, if you take that into terms of generations, I figured if you do 25 years as a generation, you're up to, I did a calculation, 70, 150 generations of people.
Amazing. Absolutely
in one
amazing.
Place. Yeah.
Did you work with the tribe at all? Were you working with tribal archives at all? Did you get the chance to talk to tribal members? Or
I talked with tribal members. There's a tribal elder who was born and raised in the Mono Basin, and he lived in and around here for quite some time. But this is part of the tragedy of the Kizedeka. They never had, and they still don't have, federal recognition as a tribe. So this tribal elder moved down to Bishop, where there is a tribal council and their tribal recognition. It's the Paiute Shoshone tribe in Bishop, which is 60 miles south of here. So I was able to, and he is a really interesting guy. He he's my age, so we have that to share. But he was interested in collecting all the stories that were possible to know about the Kizataka so they could recreate what their lifeways were like. What was the round of life? But more than that, he also was interested in the documentation, real documentation. So he's collected documents. He's got documents all over the place that he's collected on the tribe that he was willing to share with me, both his oral knowledge and then his documentary knowledge as well.
This reminds me, I was in the field one day with a Southern Ute elder, a buddy of mine named Muzz Penacus. And he's going around and he's showing me my favorite tree in Colorado is called the ponderosa pine. Okay, and it's a very beautiful tree. And Muzz was showing me, he's like, hey, this tree is the grandfather of these trees over here, and teaching me in a lot of ways. So you're talking about the migration of trees, and I'm immediately thinking about this knowledge of Muzz and the people who taught him how these trees move, and things like that. And
by the way, the Jeffreys and ponderosa pines are very closely related. They if you look at them, you'd say it's the same tree, and the way you tell the difference is that the pine cones of the Jeffrey pine have their little barbs turned under. So if you pick up a Jeffrey pine cone and you rub it in your hands, it doesn't hurt. You pick up a ponderosa pine and you rub it in your hands, you get the pickers going in it. Mm-hmm. So it's gentle Jeffrey, prickly ponderosa.
That's good. Do they have the same smell? Because Pondo's got that smell that I really enjoy.
You stick your nose in there and you get the vanilla.
It's good.
It is.
I want to back up for a quick second because the part of me right now with the Forest Service right now, I'm kind of writing this history of the grasslands, and my boss is like, "Hey, can you look at writing this?" So I'm like, "Yeah, I can do it," but I'm a specialist in the Southeast. I can talk to you about the grasslands in Florida all day long, but this is a completely different culture. The histories are different, things like that. What was that process like for you? Really, kind of coming from talking about China and these processes, overseas. Was it an exciting thing? Was it intimidating to say, I'm going to pick up and do something completely different and in a completely different space? You've got to familiarize yourself with these. What's that like for you?
So, but as you know, as an environmental historian, you have to start with the environment. You got to figure out.
Thank you.
That's where you got to start. And so I developed tools of just simply saying, okay, well, how did this work? How did that work? So let me tell you a story about how I did that in my Tigers book. So the idea for that book came from me just simply my previous book, the dissertation. I wound up with an interesting question. Why are there so many Chinese? Right? The population went from 150 million in 1600 to about 350 million in 1800. How the hell did that how's that possible, right? So it's a question of food supply.
It's food surplus, right?
It's food. It's food. Right. And so the Chinese were just damn good farmers. And so, and the way in which they expanded their farmland was by removing forest. Right. They remove forest. And it turns out that forests in South China in particular, especially the ecotone between forest and then open grasslands, and there are plenty of grasslands, is the habitat of tigers. Right. And so when I was doing some of the research on that book, I was living in Washington, D.C., and I said, I need to call somebody at the Washington Zoo, at the D.C. Zoo, the National Zoo, who knows something about tigers. And so I called him up and I went down. His name is John Seidenstecker. He's head of a tiger project throughout the world now to preserve tigers. So I went and saw John and he said, yeah, come on down to the cat house. And so we had some interesting talks, but he asked me a couple of questions that I didn't have answers to. He said, well, tigers, that I know of, and he studied tigers in India. So the tigers that I know of, their prey are things like deer and boar and this, that, and the other thing. He said, well, what kinds of animals are in the forest in South China? And I said, I don't know. I don't know. How do you find that? But the thing is that it was possible using sources that the Chinese had constructed and kept to begin reconstructing what animals were in the forest, and also what trees were in the forest, what was being removed. So you get engaged with people, and they ask you questions, and if you have a certain amount of integrity, you can say, I don't know the answer to that, but I can find out. And so that's what it was like being here. I don't know the answer to what the environment was like and how it changed, but I can find out. I can ask questions. I can say, what are the food sources? What's the biotic community like? How does it fit together? And how does it change over time? Because the main issue is, what is the relationship of humans to nature? And we have a very, very difficult story of our relationship to nature, right? But we have to figure that out and see the way in which humans and natural resources and environment interact over time, over long periods of time, to be able to get some answers to that. And if you ask the questions as a historian, you can find answers. Some of our sources are documentary sources, and I found some really great documentary sources. But others, you have to rely on the paleoanthropologists, archaeologists to do that work for you. But you ask the questions, you begin to getting some answers, and then what I don't know what you found, but I like to synthesize as much as I like to analyze. It's two parts of the same thing, but synthesizing and putting together the long story and making it apparent to people that we're not the first ones to confront these issues is fun.
Can I tell you a thing that I chuckled at when I was reading the book?
Yeah.
There were these little phrases, subtitles and headings: changes in the land, a plague of sheep. I remember I was, there were very conscious homages to other historians and things like that. And of course, you talk about sheep. Eleanor G.K. Melville's book is foundational. To understanding that. I very much loved what you were doing with that and seeing that. And I guess here's the big question though: the changes we talk about, you've established, what that landscape is like. You've established who the people are, and quite literally,
yes.
The people, right? And then we talk about history. What is history? It's change over time. Is one description of it. So what happens then, Bob, when the European Americans show up, when they start invading indigenous lands of Paiute and other folks out here in this basin? How did they encounter this landscape, and then what changes as a result of it?
Well, the driving force for that is the gold rush.
Okay.
Right. It's the California gold rush. It's the 49ers. And most of that, it starts on the west side of the Sierra Nevada. Right. That's where all the gold is. But it's then discovered over here by 1852, 1853. Gold is discovered in the mountains around us here. And so first it's miners who come and they have to eat. They have to do all the kinds of things they do, and most of the food and everything that they're consuming for the first 2 or 3 years in the late 50s comes over from the west side on wagon loads of food, canned food, this, that, and the other. Everything's canned. But pretty soon it becomes clear that settlers who know something about agriculture, if they're from European background, if they're from Ohio, begin saying, well, there's a market here. We can come out to California. We don't have to mine, but we can, in fact, grow crops. We can raise sheep. We can raise cattle. We can supply this booming demand that's coming from the 100,000 or more miners who are coming here. The problem is water.
Yeah.
There's a lot of land. There's a lot of land in the Great Basin, but only very small amounts of fresh water. So what we have here in the Mono Lake Basin is there's 3 streams that come down out of the snow-capped peaks that bring water into Mono Lake. Now, for most of the time, that water was going into Mono Lake unobstructed, but these busy beaver European settlers begin diverting water out of these streams onto their ranches and their farmland to make it productive. And so from in a very short period of time, for about 20 years, 1880s to around 1900, the number of farms and ranches that cover the Mono Lake Basin just transforms it from a sagebrush community into a sown community of alfalfa, corn, all kinds of stuff. It becomes a green space, at least in the western part and southern. The eastern part of the lake, there's no fresh water. You can't get it there. So the European American settlers are diverting water out of the main streams to their land and transforming the land from a sagebrush community into one that can be called it's a sown crops, and they come from Europe, they come from North America, and they simply replace all the native vegetation, transform it like that.
I don't want to say there's a villain in the story, but Los Angeles is lurking, Bob, at all times. I feel like as I'm reading this book, I'm like, LA is waiting. The story we're going to get into Los Angeles here, and I've often talked about how really after say indigenous warfare ended against the United States, the United States ended a say wounded knee, and I put that in air quotes for people listening.
Yeah,
it takes on this different. It takes on this different facet. It becomes an environmental warfare against native people. In this case, you're radically changing native homelands and things like that.
Yeah. Have you had Ben Madley on to talk about an American genocide?
I read him. When I was finishing my work at Minnesota, I finished my PhD in 22. So his work, I read him as I was finishing up, and really admired his work. And I very much want to have him on because we do try to do a lot of native stuff here. So he's on there.
So. There's various ways of thinking about where we're located.
Okay.
Right. And it turns out, Ben's book, Madley's book, An American Genocide, I forgot the subtitle, the War on California Indians, right?
Yeah.
It covers a period of about 30 years. But the armed forces, the militias, they start from the north on the west side of the Sierra Nevada. They come down through the gold mines and all the way down to Southern California and come around the corner of the Sierra Nevadas into the Owens Valley by early 1860s. There's nobody coming, no military forces coming from the north. So one of the last battles in this American genocide in California takes place in the Owens Valley. And Madley says that in that war, there were two parts of that war, early 1860s and then 1865, 66. And Madley says that was the last of the major genocidal episodes in California's war against California Indians. And he said, then it stopped. And he says, well, why did it stop then? And his answer is that from 1850, when there were about 300,000 California Indians in the part of the world that became California, by 1870, there were only 15,000 left. That's the definition of genocide. And he says the reason why it stopped, why the war stopped in Owens Valley, 60 miles south of here, is because there weren't any more Indians to kill. So Mono Lake Basin is peripheral to that great genocide, and those forces don't get up here. But the settlers do, and expressions of military force are around. They're made manifest, and so it's a combination of settlers and then the forces of the U.S. military that really changed the world.
Well, I want to know, like, how does Los Angeles factor into this? Because all of a sudden we've got this growing space. The city down there, is it the Emerald City? Is that where? Is that? I forget
No,
what.
I don't think that's not it.
I can't recall. There was a terrific book on this. But we know LA is coming. Okay, how does this water end up here?
All right. So first, until about 1900, the Euro-American settlers and miners were not looking south to LA. They were looking north. Everything was pushed out north, up to Carson City and then Reno, and then from over the passes to San Francisco. That's where everything was oriented, and that's where capital was coming from as well.
Mm-hmm.
So Los Angeles is 300 miles to the south. And the the interesting thing about it is that we're at 6,000 feet above sea level. That's where the lake is. That's where the streams are coming in. The Owens Valley is about 4,000 feet above sea level. And you know what Los Angeles is? It's on this. It's on the ocean. It's about 50 feet above sea level. So you know which way water tends to flow?
Yeah, down.
Down.
Turns out that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So Los Angeles, as a growing municipality, it reached over 1.5 million people by the 1920s. And they were projecting, even at the end of the 1800s, that the city was going to grow and grow fast. But what it needed was water. There are sources of water locally, but the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and its leader, a guy by the name of William Mulholland, began looking north, saying, we should know, where does this water come from? Where's it going to? And so the snow melt that got into the Owens Valley wound up in a lake called Owens Lake at the very base. Let's see, it'd be about 100 miles from Los Angeles. And if you followed the water up the Owens River, you could see where it starts from. It starts just on the other side of the Mono Lake Basin. And so the city of Los Angeles began buying up property secretly that had riparian water rights. And then when they had enough of a grip on the land, they began building their aqueduct to take water out of the Owens Valley first. And that was built in the around 1910, 1912. And so Los Angeles is in the Owens Valley by the early 1900s. But the city of Los Angeles is insatiable in the amount of water it can consume. And so pretty soon they begin looking up to the Mono Lake Basin, saying, there's water up there too, fresh water. There's fresh water. How do we get it? How do we get it down to our neck of the woods, down to Los Angeles? And I can do the short version, but then we're going to have to come back around to something that's really important. Los Angeles did ultimately get control of land and water in the Mono Basin by 1931, 1932, and began carving a tunnel 6 miles underneath the volcanic range to begin to figure out how to get water out of the Mono Lake Basin. And it did. And so water was flowing out of the Mono Lake Basin through diversions by 1941. And that then precipitated the ecological crisis in the Mono Lake because by 1970 or so, the amount of water that Los Angeles took out decreased the size of the lake, the surface level by about a third, and the volume by about a half. And so it became increasingly saline and unsuitable for life, to say the least. Now, if you want to, I got to go back to one important
thing.
Go
for it. I know where you're going. Keep going.
Okay. So the important thing is that there were struggles before Los Angeles got interested in taking the water from the Mono Lake Basin. You had the Euro-American settlers who were interested in the area. They settled here. They wanted the water for agriculture. And there was a guy by the name of Wally McPherson who said, well, what we need to form a mutual ditch company where we can actually take larger amounts of water, put it into a canal that would ring the lake, and we could then make this into a jewel, an emerald jewel up here, much like was happening in the Central Valley and down in the Imperial Valley. But there was another group of people led by a fellow by the name of J.S. Kane, who had gotten fabulously wealthy in the gold mines in nearby Bodie, who had a different vision for the use of water. And his vision was that the water needed to be used for hydroelectric power development. And so from 1910 to 1925, he and his companies built 3 hydroelectric projects on the 3 major streams coming down into the lake. Those are they're still working. I can see them. I can hear them from where I sit right here, the Rush Creek hydro station there. But to protect their interests in containing the water, getting the water for hydroelectric purposes, they went around and bought up nearly all of the available ranch and farmland in the Mono Lake Basin. There was about 10,000 acres that was being watered by farms and ranchers from Leviney Creek and Rush Creek. Kane and his companies bought that land up, and so by early 1920s, they had monopolized land and water rights. They owned all 10,000 acres of the land. Okay, they owned it. The conflict between the use of water for agriculture and the use of water for hydroelectric power development was won by the hydroelectric power development folks. They won. And what they decided to do, just as an aside, the power that was being generated from these plants went first a little bit into the mines in Nevada, silver and gold mines in Nevada. But the big market was in the south, not the city of Los Angeles, because the city of Los Angeles had a monopoly on water and power in the city of Los Angeles, but to the east of the city of Los Angeles, in Imperial, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties, which were agricultural, and they could be if they had more water, and which they did, and power. So I don't put this in the book because I figured it out later. But do you know what the electric power that was sent 232 miles down from here down to eastern parts of Los Angeles, San Bernardino? Do you know what the electricity was used for in the early 1920s?
Early 1920s.
Yeah.
San Bernardino.
Yep.
I have no idea.
There's more fruits and vegetables being grown east of L.A. than you can possibly imagine. Do you think all those people are? It's being the market is in Los Angeles for all that stuff?
Really?
The answer is no. You know where the railroads go? East. Fresh vegetables, fresh fruit are packed onto in boxcars and sent to Omaha, Chicago, all the big cities out east. That's where California starts becoming the vegetable supplier of vegetables to the entire country. Now, the thing is that vegetables and fruits can rot rather quickly. So what do you need? You need refrigerated cars. What's used for refrigeration in the 1920s? Ice.
Right.
So the electricity is making huge amounts of ice that is used to pack the vegetables in that are sent out to the cities of the Midwest and keeping them from getting scurvy as well with oranges that are shipped out there.
You're telling me now Al Capone has a story, part of this, and this actually, it's funny, Bob, because this is actually what becomes fascinating are these links, like across the country, as a result of this. Like, keep going.
So anyway, the hydropower electric interests had a monopoly of land and water, but they decided in the early 20s that they didn't want to be in the land and water business up here. They wanted to be focused on hydroelectric power development. So they put all of their land and water in a package. In at the end of 1923 and approached the city of Los Angeles with an offer. And it was an offer they could refuse. They offered to sell them all the land and water rights in the Mono Lake Basin for about $7 million. Mulholland didn't bite at that time. The reason is that he was in Los Angeles was in a crisis. The city of Los Angeles had built a huge dam, the St. Francis Dam, which in 1923 or 22 had collapsed, and thousands of people were killed with the collapse of the dam. The city of Los Angeles was in effect conducting a war in the Owens Valley against the farmers there who didn't want the water going to Los Angeles. So he said, "Yeah, we're not interested at this point." But at the end of the 1920s, the hydroelectric power company repackaged it, did some other things, and approached the city again. And at this time, the city had already floated a bond issue. I think it was $8 million, maybe more than that. Maybe I forgot exactly how much it was. That came into their coffers in 1930 and 31. And they also then went to the Congress to get the rights to take the water from the Mono Lake Basin. And that was actually passed as well. So they bit and they bought all of this packaged land that had been monopolized in a previous period in the Mono Lake history. So the reason why that's important, and it's crucial for understanding why the Mono Lake Basin is different from every other saline basin in America, or at lots of other places that have problems, is that with that transaction, there became one diverter of water out of the Mono Lake Basin, one entity that was responsible for the environmental damage that occurred, and one entity that could be held responsible for repairing that damage. And that was the city of Los Angeles and its Department of Water and Power. There was one diverter. Unlike Great Salt Lake, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of farmers and ranchers who are diverting water out of that goes into their farms and ranches and not into Great Salt Lake. So if you have to deal with trying to get a handle on and deal with the environmental damage being caused by one of 1,000 farms, how do you get a handle on that? How do you begin to deal with that? But for this circumstances, this contingency, we historians like to talk about contingencies. The contingency was that the land and water had already been monopolized by hydroelectric power interests, and then they sold it to the one diverter who had the $7 million to be able to buy it all, and that was the city of Los Angeles. So they became owner, lock, stock, and barrel of the land and water rights in the Mono Lake Basin and did with it as they will. And that's what they did.
I want to ask you now, I work for the government, so I'm not allowed to say the word climate change. But where does Mono Lake sit now in terms of when we talk about where we are, globally, in terms of climate change, environmental transformation? You talk about how this saline lake is really kind of different than the other ones in the West. Why should we continue to pay attention to this particular lake, and does it offer us hope moving forward? Where are we now?
Yeah. So, first of all, the 10,000-year history that we can look back on, our paleoanthropologists and archaeologists have done us a really great favor, but paleobotanists, by identifying two periods in the history of the lake over the last 2,000 years where there were mega droughts. One for about 200 years, around 2,000 years ago, and then one for another 200 years, about 1,000 years ago. And each time, the lake recovered. It didn't go out of business. It didn't dry up. It was there through those mega droughts. I don't know how bad they were, but climate change isn't new. Climate has been changing for quite some time, and we have experienced serious droughts up here quite a bit. So. There's been a lot of work that's been done on what's known as a water balance model for trying to understand how much water needs to go into the lake, how much water is going out of the lake, how much is being lost to evaporation, how much is going to be lost to evaporation if the climate warms by 5 degrees Celsius, for example. What's going to happen? And so this new model was put together by UCLA water scientists about a year ago and has been presented to the California State Water Board as a tool that needs to be used to assess how much water needs to be going into the Mono Lake to keep it a healthy ecosystem. The uncertainties going forward are, how much is climate going to change over the next 20 years? How much is it going to change the lake? What about 50 years from now? What about 100 years from now? Those of us who think about this stuff worry about it. And we know what the global warming gases are. Methane is in the atmosphere for about 10 years. That comes from farting cows up here and cattle and rice paddies and everything else. But we know how to get a handle on some of that. And if you could stop the methane is more powerful than carbon dioxide. And we can begin getting a handle on that. Carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere for about 1,000 years. And I end the book on a hopeful note saying, let's think about 10,000 years out from now. But I have to think that 1,000 years from now, if we start working on it now, and we are working on it now, we're making some progress, current administration notwithstanding, we could be tipping the trend, not from going like this, but leveling out and then beginning to decline in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide in the air and in the water and in the soil and sequestering it elsewhere. So I could be a short-term doomer, but I'm a long-term hoper.
I like this.
That's
fair. I find myself doom scrolling on the internet on a nightly basis. And then hoping for the best.
No. So, I mean, that's you want to know why 10,000 years in the past, why we can look out 10,000 years in the future is because nature is resilient. There is this relationship that we have to nature. We are in nature. We can't be separate from it. We may be a very aggressive, greedy species that doesn't know when it's following its own nest. But, Earth Day was only, how many years ago? That'd be 55 years ago.
Mm.
And I think we are, I think we are making progress, but it's going to be a long slog. And we have to have the long-term view to be able to keep us going.
Well, Bob, I prepped you on a lot of these questions ahead of time, so you knew what you were walking into. Now I want to give you a couple of questions that I didn't prep you for.
Okay.
These are short little questions, so you can have some fun with them. You're a historian, so if you could time travel to one era in the Mono Basin history, where do you go?
Time travel in terms of time or place? No,
time and place. Where do you want to see it?
There are several times. I'd like to see the time when people who were here began figuring out how to make it a long-term place to inhabit for thousands of years. They probably didn't think that they're making choices for the 1,000 years. They might have thought they were making choices for the next 2 or 3 generations, which is what the families were. But those choices made it a sustainable life for those people for several millennia. Now that's a good record, right? I don't think I'd want to be around here when the U.S. military, middle of the 19th century, is killing people.
Yeah.
So,
Well, let me ask you this. This podcast initially started off as a film podcast. We talked about film and history. We still do a lot. And obviously, the first thing I'm thinking about as I get into this book is Chinatown. So I want to ask you, of all the people in this book, who is most worthy of a really good film or a miniseries? Like, who do you like in this? Who deserves to be on the screen?
as a good guy or a bad guy? I mean,
your pick. They could be a villain, absolutely. Because I'm thinking Mulholland right now, and people might have some thoughts. But who do you like?
Well, that would continue the LA centric narrative. Well, so does Chinatown, but Chinatown is basically about taking the water and spreading it into the valley out there for not for agriculture, but for real estate development. Well, when I first presented the book to the University of California Press, it was much longer than it currently is. And I had a lot of material on this extraordinarily interesting struggle between the agricultural interests and the hydroelectric power interests. And there were very powerful people. And the way I was able to get at the detail on this was because the lawyers for the hydroelectric projects donated their papers to the Huntington Library. And when lawyers donate their papers, you can get a lot of dirt on them. And so I could make them come to life. And I really got into that. And the editor at the UC Press said, "You got to cut about 30,000 words out of this." And the only way you can cut 30,000 words is by complete sections, you can't edit your way out of that. So a lot of that drama got cut. It's a drama in the teens and the 20s.
You get a sense of that in the book for certain. Like there's definitely some teasing that there's more here, and that kind of gets at one of the questions that I always like to ask is like, what's not in the book? Because there's always something. There's always a story that every author says, "Gosh, I wish I could have talked about this," or "I'm going to save this for another story."
Yeah, well, that's one of them. The other that stuff that got dropped is I had a huge amount on the restoration activities in the basin, forced on the Department of Water and Power. I mean, it was very detailed. Some of it's heroic, some of it's stupid, some of it, LA didn't want to do this and they were forced to do it. They were held, yes, right. City of Los Angeles was held accountable for environmental damage and they had to fix it. But a lot of that's on the cutting room floor too.
You did a lot of reading before you started writing here. Was there a historian of the West or the environment that you really like? Do you think we should be reading aside from your book?
Well, I think Dan Flores is terrific.
Yeah.
Sarah Dant has the environmental history of the American West. And Don Worster did Rivers of Empire, which is about the controlling the water in California, for the most part in California, but elsewhere as well. And as I said, I think Benjamin Madley's book on American genocide is just crucial for understanding how we got to where we're at.
Yeah, all of those people are people I read deeply. As I was going, Dan is my favorite historian, bar none. Period. Which was when Sarah came on the pod the first time, she laughed at me the whole time when she said, "Yeah, I think I like his work a little bit more than me." And I'm like, "Do you?" So, do you have a favorite memory of your time out on the basin?
Well, laying on the shore on a clear, moonless night, looking up at the Milky Way with my wife it's just astounding. Some of the people I mentioned in the preface were there. A woman who was with the California State Parks, state parks, was a ranger, and they would do star talks, and the star talks would bring tourists, bring young people, all kinds of other people, and you have to wait till till it got dark enough before the stars would start coming out. And so what would happen is that as it got dusk, huge numbers of bats are out there winging around, picking up insects and doing things, just going zoom, 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 zoom. So Janet Carl made up a song for the kids. Bats eat bugs, they don't eat people. And she had a whole tune set up to go with that. And then we could just lay there and look up at the Milky Way and just ponder what you're looking at. You know, we're in this galaxy, and we're looking out to the edges of it. You know, it's just.
Is there when you think back on this book, is there one thing you want people to take away from it?
A long-term view is necessary, both to understand the contingencies of how we got here. So let me put it this way. As a teacher, one of the things I wanted my students to understand is that what happened in the past did not have to turn out the way it was. It was contingent on this having happened, that having happened, something else having happened. The past is contingent. Where we are now is contingent. Now, if you take that into the future, you say, if the past is contingent on what people did or didn't do, so too is the future. And we can take from that the strength to do what is necessary to do, to bend things one way or another. We don't have to sit here and take it. You know, that's what I mean. So if the past was contingent, so too is the future, and it's contingent upon what we do now.
That's very much that hopeful line that you were getting at.
It is, yes.
Well, then, Bob, you've been writing this book for a while. It's out now.
Yeah.
Talk about 10,000 years in the past.
Yeah.
What comes next for you? What's in your future? What's in your contingency?
Well, I have to tell you, I'm about to come up on the next birthday, 3 weeks from now. I'll be 77. You know, that's a contingency. There's nothing I can do about that. Right? No, so I'm really in the moment. I've got book talks and book signings set up for the entire summer up and down the Eastern Sierra. Trying to get into bookstores in the Bay Area, into Los Angeles. There's a public radio station in Los Angeles called KPCC, Pasadena City College. It's now renamed itself, but they've got a guy there his name is Larry Mantle. He's done a drive time program for the last 40 years called Air Talk, and he's going to interview me in a week or so on live. It's an NPR station, but it's drive time, 10:40 to 11 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, we'll be getting into the city of Los Angeles, and there's just a lot of education that needs to go on still about what's happening up here and why it's important, not just simply to the city of Los Angeles, but to that reminds me, I'm going to come back to this, to Wilson's phalaropes, but to the health of entire ecosystems and species that span the entire Western Hemisphere. Yeah. So I want to end it. The conclusion.
Tell me.
Okay, this is William Blake, Auguries of Innocence, right? And then we've got the line drawing of the phalarope.
Mm-hmm.
To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. You know, it's probably one of the most famous openings of a poem. But I'm going to be doing book clubs as well. And here's a, and maybe you can want to take this one on. I want to ask them, what is an augury? How do you define augury? And how is that connected with the appearance on every page, the title page of chapters with the line drawing of a phalarope? Do you know what an augury is?
No, tell me.
Okay. It started in Roman times, but it's the forecasting of omens by paying attention to the behavior of birds to forecast the future, in effect. And Blake's poem, Auguries of Innocence, he wants to show the intimate connection at the very smallest levels between all living things. And an augury, you know, there's not birds in there, but that's what the definition of an augury is. So I'm going to give that challenge to book clubs to figure it out. It's not like a Dan Brown novel. This isn't a clue to, but it is. It's a clue. And if you think deeply about it, you can put these things together and come up with some interesting stuff. So, yes, we're looking at birds, and birds can be an omen for the health of the future.
Well,
the Wilson's phalarope.
I loved it, Bob. To follow with our water, I was thirsting for this book, Bob. I saw it and I was very much looking forward to talking to you. I was so excited to do so. I'm so excited to get to meet you and talk to you today. Yeah. Man, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a blast, man.
We could obviously talk a lot more.
I have thoughts. I'll tell you in a second.
Maybe we will.
We will. And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to Bob Marks for coming in today and talking to us about this amazing space, the Mono Lake Basin out in California. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for continuing to make this show run. And most of all, thank you to all of you for continuing to show up, show out, and share this show with all of your friends. If you want to help support the pod, you can absolutely subscribe right now. You can share it on social media. You can tell your friends about it. Stay tuned. We've got a ton of stuff coming for you this summer. We'll see you later. Ciao for now.